That's what that's from. Hope everybody's doing well. Had a good week. Getting ready to start another good week. Hi, Sierra. This is a class on the biblical books of poetry. And Alan has worksheets if you'd like one. We're looking at the Psalms this morning. Anybody have anything you want to talk about from Job? We did Job last week. We did it all in one class. Well, we can come back to it if anybody has anything they want to discuss or any observations or questions about Job. All right. Nobody got anything. If you think of them later, we can cover them later. But this morning we're in the Psalms. How you doing, Bill? He doesn't have his hearing aid in, so. What's that, Bernice? Oh, okay. You're all fired up for VBS, aren't you, Nita?
Well, yes.
Yeah.
I'll really be able to enjoy it starting this evening when it's all done.
Right, when you get it all done, when it gets cranked up. Oh, by the way, if you're visiting with us, tonight is the first night of our Vacation Bible School. So be sure and come back and get some cookies and Kool-Aid and all the good stuff that goes with it. All right, everybody got a worksheet that wants one? Alan's still got a few left. Got some hands down here. Do we have enough? Get those hands up if you want one so he can see. All right. We're just filling in a few blanks here. This is sort of an introductory page to give us a place to start with the Psalms. The Psalms were originally poems sung to blank accompaniment. Musical accompaniment, usually the harp. David is probably one of the best known guys for using a harp, and that's what the Psalms were originally. Psalms is the English title to this volume of work, whereas the blank title, what language would the Psalms have originally been written in? Hebrew. The Hebrew title is Praises or Book of Praises. And you'll find that with other books in the Bible. The Hebrews had one name for them, we have another. When you translate from one language into another, the translators sort of have an input into what the book is going to be called because they don't always have titles necessarily.
Chant in what we would say is a chant rather than a song.
Some of them might have been. And there's different kinds of musical style, but that's one of the things about the Psalms. They didn't have the music. When you look in our songbooks, you've got the lines, and I don't even know when those lines were invented with the musical notes. But you can tell by those musical notes the style of the music it is, whereas if you've only got the words, you can't really tell as much. But some of them probably were chants. The thing about a chant is, what's normally the nature of a chant? Anybody? What's your impression of a chant? It's repetitious. It's the same thing over and over, which is, you hear a lot of that today. Some of the songs, the modern songs, are almost chants. That's not a criticism or a knock. That's just a matter of fact. So reading the words doesn't always tell us what the music was, and we don't really know what the music was. I used to have a cassette tape, for those of you old enough to remember what a cassette tape is. And it was, the name of the group was the Liberated Wailing Wall. And they were Jewish people who had been converted to a form of Christianity, and they were gifted musically, and so they sang and played a lot of songs that were Bible-oriented with Hebrew music. And if you've ever heard Hebrew music, it's quite a bit different from what we hear normally in the West. It has a very different cadence, a very different sound. And so music is kind of, and you can, when you hear a piece of music, if it's from another culture, you can usually identify, oh, that's from another culture, and you can often identify where it comes from based on the instrument being used or the cadence or the count or whatever. We got any more worksheets? Alan, we out? Oh, there's a couple in the back. How you doing, Judy? You're doing good.
They were delivered through the Red Sea and everything.
Yes.
You remember she began to sing
Yes.
with the people and everything. Well, it was just an expression that come out and they all began to sing
Right.
of thanksgiving to God. And that's what we're supposed to do.
Some of the Psalms are particularly Psalms of thanksgiving. We'll get into that in the latter part of the worksheet. But the Psalms are all poetic expressions of emotion, even though some of them are dealing with history. Just because it involves emotion doesn't mean it's not necessarily accurate, factual, historical. All right. Number 2, there are 7 known authors connected with the Psalms. I left a big blank there so you could spell out 7, but if you want to write the number 7, just make sure it's extra wide to fill in that blank.
What's that last blank on number 1?
Oh, the last blank on number 1, Hebrew. Hebrew. Psalms is the English title to this volume of work, whereas the Hebrew title is Praises or Book of Praises. Number 2, the second sentence, the Hebrew version credits David with authoring 73 of the Psalms. When they wrote the Septuagint, I think it was increased to like 87 that they attributed to David. I don't know how they figured one or the other, but so 73 are definitely attributed to David, and there may be some others. Korah was credited with at least 11. Did you get that? Korah had 11, at least 11, and Asaph with 12. Korah and Asaph were leaders of the blank who sang. Who do you think would be in that blank? Levites. The Levites. There were Levite singers. And Korah and Asaph were 2 of the leaders of that group. Maybe you could find one of their CDs somewhere. Korah and the Levites. You'll just have to Google it. It might go back as far as 8 tracks. Who remembers 8-track tapes? Oh yeah, okay. 4 tracks. Well, I'm not even going to ask that one. So. Solomon is given credit for 2 psalms. Moses for 1, and 1 is ascribed to Ethan. He-Man. Anybody remember watching He-Man as a kid? I don't think it's the same guy. But he shares credit for Psalm 88 with the sons of Korah. All other psalms included with these are referred to as, anybody know the answer there? Orphan psalms, since the authors are unknown. So those are the 7 names, 7 people that we know are associated with authoring the Psalms, and the rest of them just kind of up in the air. Number 3, since Moses brought Israel out of Egypt around 1500 to 1400 BC, and David's reign was around 1000 BC, we get an idea of when the Psalms began to be recorded. You ever wonder how many songs there are in history, and you don't have to go that far back, that nobody ever wrote down? I know there are a lot of songs that grandmothers used to sing to babies, especially, and Debbie knows some of those songs from the Czech culture, and it's very interesting because it's hard to find them written down anywhere. And when you hear Native American songs, I don't know how many of those have been written down. I don't know if there was a way to write those down 200, 300 years ago. But they have songs, and songs mean a lot to us as individuals, our culture, our families. Any of you grandmothers ever sing to your grandbabies? I don't know why, but when Jamie was first born and I would rock her, the only song that really seemed suitable to me to sing, And I knew she was too little to understand the words, but I would sing Battle Hymn of the Republic. Yeah, that's a, what, Marty? I know, I'm weird. But I knew it. I knew the words, and it was something I could sing, and anyway. It can be soothing if you sing it softly. Yes, and the way you say something makes all the difference. Sing with a smile. Where are we here? Oh, we're on number 3 still. Psalm 137, however, is from the time of Judah's exile. You remember that? Babylonians came, carried Judah away into captivity, started in 606. There were actually 3 deportations, but it began in 606. How long was that captivity supposed to last, according to prophecy? 70 years. And after 70 years, the guy that God named through Isaiah, Cyrus, sent Israel back to Jerusalem. Sent them back to rebuild the temple, sent them back to rebuild the walls. Which brings us to the next line here. Psalm 137, however, is from the time of Judah's exile, and 107 and 126 are likely post-exilic, or after the exile was over. Psalm 44 and 79 may also belong to this last group. It's just like today, when somebody writes a song, they don't always think, okay, and when I've written the lyrics to this song, now I need to put a date on this and let everybody know what the historical background was of this song and what the story behind the song. People just don't do that so much. I've got in mind sometime, I want to preach a sermon based on some rock and roll songs and draw some lessons out of it. How many of you know the rock and roll song, Smoke on the Water? That's a cool song. Do you know the story behind it? They were at a concert, and some guy got drunk and shot off a flare gun and set the place on fire. And fire trucks came and sprayed water on everything, and smoke on the water. You think, oh, that's really deep. No, some nut set the place on fire. That's what that's all about. CSI, anybody watch CSI and you hear, I think it's CSI, the theme song, Who Are You? From the Guess Who? Who are you? Ooh, 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 ooh. And that sounds like a deep, probing, thought-provoking song as well. You know the story behind that song? The guy that wrote the lyrics got drunk one night, and he was passed out on the street. And this was up in Canada, and the Canadian police came by, whatever town it was, and the guy that rolled him over recognized him, the lead singer for the group. Yeah, well, hey, if you can get up and walk home, I'll want to arrest you. And I said, what was that? Well, who are you? And that's the whole story. And if you listen to the lyrics of the song, because you think, who are you? That's a really deep, probing, thoughtful song. No, it's about a guy being drunk on the street, and the police said, I recognize you. Who are you? Yeah, I know who you are. Get up and go home, or I won't arrest you. That's In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida. Anybody remember In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida from the 70s? You know how that song got its name? I mean, you think, In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida, what a title, man. The producers of the record didn't have a title for the song, so they went to the hotel room to get the title for the song from the guys that did it, and they were all stoned. And the title is supposed to be In the Garden of Eden. But they asked the guys, what's the title? In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida. Write that down, In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida. And so, see, you got all these songs from our culture, which it's interesting. You start comparing these to the histories of the Psalms, it's like, whoa, what is going on here? But these Psalms also have stories. They're not like those stories. They're very significant stories. Who remembers Johnny Horton? Johnny Horton. I grew up listening to his songs, and he sang about things like sinking the Bismarck. It was a historical thing that took place. He sang about, in 1814, we took a little trip along with Colonel Sanders down to mighty Mississippi. Yeah. Oh, Colonel, yeah. Took a bucket of chicken, took some baked beans, and fought the bloody British in the town of New Orleans. So he sang about historical things, sang about Jim Bowie, had a song about Jim Bowie. All this music, you look at all this cool music, and it's got messages behind it and stories that can tell you something. Even if it's a dumb story, it tells you something. Don't get drunk. Don't get stoned. Don't get yourself in a situation where the place is going to be on fire. But if it does, even if it's bad, you can write a song about it and make a lot of money. Bud?
Who was the guy that said, don't roller skate in a buffalo herd?
Yeah. What was his name? Yeah, Roger Miller. He was great. Yeah. He's Roger Miller, man. He put out some stuff. What's that? Lots of funny songs, yeah. I had an aunt that just thought his stuff was stupid. I just can't stand that Roger Miller. I thought, well, I really like Roger Miller. I think he's pretty funny. Anyway. But these songs, they had a message behind them. They had a story behind them. They had history. These were written by people who had an interest in God, and God saw fit to have them recorded for our posterity. So we're talking about music that's 3,000 or more years old, some of it, at least 2,500 years old. And how many of them do we sing today in our songs? How many of these lines do we incorporate in our music? And you can watch when you read the songbook, especially, it's got down at the bottom if part of that song comes out of a psalm. I used to think when I was a kid that Hallelujah, Praise Jehovah, it was one of my favorite songs that we would sing because it includes the line about dragons. Dragons, cool. And then I found out later, oh, yeah, that's what dinosaurs were likely called before they were called dinosaurs. Because last week, you remember we studied in Job that God described the behemoth to Job, and the behemoth was almost certainly a sauropod dinosaur. And then he described the Leviathan, even saying that the Leviathan would sneeze fire, and nobody could approach him because he was so huge and so violent. And every animal we know today has been captured and killed or tamed, domesticated by man, but the Leviathan was not so. So, yeah, dragons. All right, back to the worksheet. Number 4, the Psalms are divided into 5 sections or books, perhaps in imitation of the books of law. 5 books of law. What else are the books of law called that has to do with 5? The Pentateuch. The Pentateuch. Just like the Pentagon is a building with 5 sides, the Pentateuch is 5 books. And so the Psalms are divided into 5 groups, perhaps based on the law. And there I have listed the sections, books 1 through 5, and whatever Psalms are in those books. But look at the note under number 4, at the end of number 4. Psalm 119 is the longest of the Psalms and fairly evenly divided into sections corresponding to each letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Have you noticed that? When you look at the 119th Psalm, it's got this funny little, what's Aleph? What's Beth? What's Gimel? What does that mean? Well, those are the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So if you want to learn the English pronunciation of the Hebrew alphabet, just go to the 119th Psalm and read the titles of every section of the 119th Psalm, and you'll have the Hebrew alphabet. And then every one of those sections begins with the letter that is what it's called. The first section, Aleph, begins with the word or the letter Aleph. The first word begins with the letter Aleph. And then Beth and Gimel, all those letters are corresponding, which is almost certainly a help for memorization. So you understand if that's true, and it almost certainly is, what was intended to be done with the 119th Psalm? Put it to memory. Put it to memory. And one of the passages in there is David saying, "Thy word have I done what with? Hidden in my heart," which doesn't only imply memorization, but it at least implies memorization. If you're going to put something in your heart, what are you doing more than memorizing it? You're understanding, but you're committing yourself to it, to heart. When I was in school, we had to learn things by heart. That means you couldn't look at notes. You had to say it from memory. I don't know why they didn't say learn it from memory, but perhaps the idea is from heart because they really wanted us to have it in more than just our memory. Number 5, there are various types of psalms, just as we have various types of hymns today. Oh, I'm sorry. The theme of Psalm 119 is dedication to the Word of God. every single verse in Psalm 119, except I think for one, mentions word or precepts or commandments or teachings. I think there's only one verse of that psalm that does not have a word specifically referencing the Word of God or the teachings of God, the precepts of God. Everybody got all the blanks filled in so far? Any alibis? All right. Oh, Titus. The first one for number 4 is law. The Psalms are divided into 5 sections or books, perhaps in imitation of the books of law. You bet. Anybody else? I don't make these worksheets for nothing. I want you to have them filled in. All right, number 5. There are various types of psalms, just as we have various types of hymns today. Psalms of praise. Psalms of praise. Royal or messianic psalms. The Hebrew word Messiah, anybody know what that means? I am failing in my work here. Messiah, Hebrew word Messiah, means anointed of God. What is its equivalent in Hebrew? Christ. Christ. Every time I say this, I think they're going to get tired of me saying this. Messiah, anointed of God. It's Hebrew. Christ, anointed of God. It's Greek. So when you're reading a messianic psalm, who's that psalm pointed towards? It's pointed towards Christ, pointed towards Jesus, pointed towards the royal Messiah who was going to sit on the throne of David. When Jesus was called Christ, that wasn't his last name. By the way, what did the name Jesus mean? Anybody got that one? Jesus, salvation of God. It's basically the equivalent of the Old Testament Hebrew Joshua. And the Greeks would have pronounced it something like Iesus. And we call it Jesus, but it still means salvation. So you're saying, when you say Jesus, you're saying salvation. And when you say Christ, you're saying anointed of God. Jesus, salvation. Christ, anointed of God. That's what we're saying when we say those words. Yes?
During the time of David was king, his prayers about he realized the new king was coming, because he prayed about keeping around him, Israel, other people trying to overthrow him. Yet he believed in God who would send the new king, Christ, the Lord of Lords.
Yes. Right. One of the best ways we understand how well David knew that was the relationship between him and Saul. Who was Saul? He was the first king. And who was king after Saul? David. What was Saul continually trying to do to David after he realized David was the one chosen to take his place? Kept trying to kill him. What would David never do, although he had opportunities to do so? He would never lift his hand against Saul. Why did he say that? Because he is the anointed of God. God had Saul anointed to be king. He was the one chosen to be the king, and David knew that. And even though Samuel had been sent to David and said, "You're now anointed to be the new king, and when the time comes, you will be the new king," David would never lift his hand against Saul. It's such a credit to his character that he was like that. Now, later on, what did he do that we would point to and say, "Oh man, that's the worst thing anybody could do"? He had Uriah killed because he didn't just have Uriah killed randomly, but because he'd already committed fornication, adultery with his wife and gotten her pregnant. So we look at that and we say, wow, what a mess. There's no explanation for any of this that justifies any of it, but David's life was a story of highs and lows. And if you think about it, when they sang about Saul and David, what did they sing about Saul and David? What are we told they sang? Saul has, yes, Saul has killed his thousands, David's killed his 10,000s. That's one of the things that made Saul so upset. Oh, he's getting more credit than I am. But if you've killed a bunch of people, and did David kill a bunch of people? Yeah. I don't know. Killing is justified, and David killed a lot of people under justified circumstances. As a matter of fact, how was he supposed to get Michal, his first wife, Saul's daughter? What was the deal for her? Kill a bunch of Philistines and bring signs of their death. So David had killed a bunch of people, and from all this stuff that happened in his life, he wrote out of the things that were stored in his heart. And I have to wonder how much of the violence that he took part in and the fear of him even being killed by his enemies, how much of that contributed to the depth of his spirit and his soul and being able to write some of the things that he did. When we talk about inspiration, I don't think God just says, oh, who will I get to write this? Oh, just get that guy and have him write it. I don't think it's just about that. I think inspiration is more than that. I think God goes, there's a guy right there who can write what I want him to write. And he picked David. And David wrote things that go very deep into the human soul and human psyche. They deal with our hurt, with our pain, with our guilt. And so David was a perfect guy to write some of these Psalms because they deal with such deep, profound emotion. Any observations or comment on that? Okay. Sure. So I don't feel so bad? All right. Yes, yes.
A lot of us probably know the answer, but I'm afraid of being wrong. There's a crowd of people.
Yeah.
I don't want to raise my hand and say it and be wrong and look stupid. So a lot of us probably know the answer and we just don't want to embarrass ourselves.
All right. Next time I ask the question, what does Messiah mean? The whole class is going to say, as one, anointed of God. Anointed of God. If when I ask, what is the Greek equivalent of the Hebrew Messiah, you will say, Christ. When I ask, what is the meaning of the Greek word Christ, you will say, anointed of God. I know I've given you a lot of stuff, and I've given you this a bunch of times, but you got to think about it. That's the thing about the Psalms, too. The Psalms were written as psalms so that they could be sung. And when you sing something, you get it in your head a little better. Don't you? Why is it that when we hear songs, sometimes songs we don't even like, they get stuck in our head? I remember just for a week, I was going, when you say, bud, you've said a lot of things. It just gets stuck in your head. It's a beer commercial. I don't want to be thinking of a beer commercial all week long, but it got stuck in my head. So when we commit ourselves to reading and studying and learning about the Psalms, these things can get stuck in our head as well, especially if we learn them with association to some kind of a melody, to music. Some of these Psalms are so excellent, and we sing them, and sometimes I think we don't even know that we're singing the Psalms, and we need to point that out to folks. These things are written not just so we can read them and pass on by, but so we can commit them to heart and to memory and to life. Yes?
I've read in some studies that when you memorize something, especially when it comes to song, it's the rhythm that it acts different in your brain, so it allows you to memorize it faster than you were to just sit down and just say it over and over to yourself. You know?
Right.
But memorization is also a skill. I think it's kind of a lost skill, but I believe that if you can take your time and really set out whether it's a song or just repeating it, I think that's a big thing to do. I don't know if that made any sense.
Well, it makes perfect sense. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Acts and the letter to the Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians and Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus and Philemon. Yeah, we can sing the whole song. Debbie down here every Sunday morning and every Wednesday night, she's down there with the 4 and 5-year-olds, and this is what she does. She takes Bible truths that she wants them to learn, and she puts them to music, and they sing little songs about all this stuff. And we do that too. There once was a little boy David down by the babbling brook. There once was a little boy David, 5 little stones he took. What about Zacchaeus? A wee little man, and a wee little man was he. See, how many Bible stories, how many Bible truths do we know if we just thought about singing the song? Marty, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to make a song about Christ and Messiah, and we're going to study that, and we're going to learn it. And then when I say, what does the word Messiah mean, and what language is it from? You're going to say, it's Hebrew, Marty, and it means anointed of God, and its equivalent is Christ. Yeah, really. We're going to come up with our own song.
We don't want to forget the aspect of poems, poetry do the same type of thing.
Yes, they do.
Rhymes and words and that type of thing also makes it easier for us to remember.
Yeah, there's a whole genre now called rap that is all about rhyming words. And while a lot of the themes of rap songs are not necessarily Christian, I made up a rap song years ago about John chapter 3. Y'all remember that, don't you? Okay. But I thought, yeah, this is because everything just sort of lent itself to being born again by water and the Spirit. Anyway, I don't remember what it was either, and I wrote it. So, but if I'd have spent more time with it, I would have. And stop and think right now, how many lyrics of songs can you think of right off the top of your head? And right now we're perhaps thinking about spiritual songs, hymns, those kinds of things we sing to worship God. Yes?
I was really surprised that my memory was getting worse, that I was playing for my granddaughter who was real interested in rock and roll. I turned on my Pandora app to the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Song after song after song after song for years and years. I knew all the words to it, could sing along to it. She goes, Penny, how do you remember all that stuff? I said, well, how do you remember the songs that you sing today? She goes, how do you teach it?
Yeah. And you probably didn't even try to memorize those songs. They were just there. And that's the way it works. You put things to music and you make it much more easy to memorize. So when we're looking at these Psalms, we're looking at more than just some old poems. Old poems. Yeah, there's a lot more to it than that. Anybody else got anything? Poetry never gets old. Nope. Yeah, I remember poems that I learned as a kid. Most of them are things that are not necessarily appropriate for a Bible class, but you learn stuff by memory, and it's funny. Number C, the Passion Psalms. Of those, the one you might be most familiar with is Psalm 22, where Jesus is pictured there by David being crucified. Now, David was never crucified, and he doesn't use the word crucifixion, but when you read what David is describing of himself, and none of those things that we know of ever actually happened to David, his hands and his feet were never pierced, but he writes about that in the 22nd Psalm. As far as we know, his garments were never gambled over, and his clothing was never divided, but he writes about that in the Psalm. He very vividly describes what happened to Jesus, although it never happened to David. Yes?
22, where Christ says, my God, why has thou forsaken me? In Psalms 1 and 2, David talked about how blessed it is to walk not in the counsel of the wicked.
Yes.
But he realized the nation's coming against him because they're coming against God's King of Kings. And he's thinking God is forsaken, but he realized God has not forsaken him because he realized God has anointed him. Therefore, no nation can stand against what God has proven to be true. So he falls back in line with the fact that I am anointed of God, I am God's servant, I'll do what God wants me to do.
Right.
And things like that.
As a matter of fact, go on and take a look at the 22nd Psalm, or let's look at it together. The 22nd Psalm starts with that passage that Jesus quoted, my God, why have you forsaken me? Far from my deliverance are the words of my groaning. And it sounds like at the outset that David has been abandoned as he writes this, but that's not true. He comes back to it in verse 19. You, O Lord, be not far off. O you, my help, hasten to my assistance. Deliver my soul from the sword, my only life from the power of the dog. Save me from the lion's mouth, from the horns of the wild oxen. You answer me. I will tell of your name to my brethren. In the midst of the assembly I will praise you. You who fear the Lord, praise him. And you descendants of Jacob, glorify him and stand in awe of him, all you descendants of Israel. For he has not despised nor abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, nor has he hidden his face from him. But when he cried to him for help, he heard. So David starts off poetically asking the question, my God, why have you forsaken me? How do you think David feels as he writes that first line? Despair, forsaken. He feels forsaken. He believes, I don't know that he believes he is, but he's writing this poetically. And what's the term we use with poetry? License, poetic license. What is poetic license? Yes, you write things that aren't necessarily true, that aren't actually true, that aren't literally true. By the way, is that or is that not an overused word in our culture today, the word literally? Yeah, literally means it actually happened just exactly like that. I hear it all the time, and when I hear the word literally, I listen to see if it's something that's going to be literal or if it's actually figurative. Like if you might hear a parent say, I'm going to tear your head off, boy, if you do that. Don't ask me where I heard that, but somebody says, we're literally going to tear his head off. No. Literally means the head actually comes off of the body. So, literally. But David is using poetic license to say, this is how I feel. This is the emotion I want to portray, that I'm abandoned by God. Anybody here ever feel abandoned by God? You don't have to raise your hand, but I think all of us have at one time or another thought, where is God? Why is he not doing something about this situation in my life? And sometimes I think God's telling me, just shut up, sit down. I'm taking care of this. Just wait. Just be patient. This won't last forever. So when Jesus quotes this, what do we know is going to happen 3 days later? Who's going to raise Jesus from the dead? God will raise him from the dead. He's not been abandoned, and that's another quote from the Psalms that Peter uses on Pentecost, that God has not abandoned my soul to Hades. Dave, or Billy.
This indication of a metaphor, like saying the lion's mouth or dogs surround me. We're talking about people, the nations surround, dogs surround me. He's referring to these people as dogs, and it's actually nations that want to do him harm. But he realizes God will not forsake him.
Right.
So therefore the metaphor, things like that can be used either way in poetry or literature.
And that's what poetic license is. You can make an exaggeration, a hyperbole, when you way overstate the fact to make a point. Titus? It's not included in the songs of lament, because a lament is normally when you're sorrow for something that has happened or something that's been done, but it's lamentful. And that's one of the things, too. If you had to classify all these psalms, how would you classify them when you start reading them? Well, this part's a lament, but this part's giving praise and glory to God. This part's giving thanks to God. It's really hard to classify. And as I read through classifications of all these psalms, I thought, well, it's not just that. It's not just this, but generally speaking, it is. What is the song Amazing Grace to us? How would you classify Amazing Grace? What kind of a song is that? Gratitude, praise. What? Uplifting. Is it a teaching psalm? Does it teach? And so you got all these aspects just with one song with which we're familiar, and the same type of thing applies with the Psalms. But Some of them are a little more one thing than another. And so that's more or less how they get classified. Number C. No, that was Passion Psalms, for which there is no blank, so that's obvious. And then D, Psalms of Zion. Zion. Let me fill in the rest of the blanks here. The last two blanks, H, is wisdom and historical psalms. And then the last one, I, is psalms of trust in God. So psalms of praise is A, royal or messianic psalms is B, D is psalms of Zion, H is wisdom and historical psalms, and I is psalms of trust in God. Those are the classifications, and I will challenge you, before you look up which psalms belong where, just give yourself an assignment to just read some psalms and see if you can classify. And you might have to be careful because some Bible translations will have an uninspired heading over the psalm telling you what it is. And so if you're going to read it and read the context and try to figure out from the context what kind of a psalm it is, you'll have to maybe have somebody take a piece of tape and tape that over before you go read, and then you can figure out what it is on your own. Well, I thought we would go through this real fast and then start actually looking at some of the Psalms, but we didn't go through it as fast as I thought. I guess that's okay. Lord willing, next week we'll come back to the Psalms. We're going to spend some time in the Psalms. We'll probably spend a day or two on Ecclesiastes and maybe one day on Song of Solomon. We'll spend more time in Proverbs, but most of our time in this class will be spent with the Psalms. So anybody have any observations or questions? Any comments you'd like to make before we close? All right. Thank you so much for being in here. I appreciate your participation. By the way, what does the word Messiah mean? Anointed of God. How about Christ? Anointed of God. Hebrew and Greek. All right. And I wasn't really upset with you guys. I was upset with me more than anything else. Class is over.